What is the art of storytelling? In the art of storytelling, you might initially see that it is simply the ability to take a thought, expand upon it, and upon said expansion, you then return back to the conclusion of the first initial thought. An effective storytelling at any particular story needs to come to a conclusion, an end that ultimately brings us back to the beginning. In any particular literature of any particular story, whether it be told through film, book, and any other art form, we essentially see that in the art of storytelling, everything stems from one particular story. And from said particular story, you might in itself have one particular story. From the initial story of all humans, known as the Bible, which can be individually awakened into their life experience, the moment you essentially arise to the moment you understand story being the first story ever told, simply retold in infinite particular ways, in infinite particular interpretations, and in infinite personal experiences. The very first story ever told once again arises at, in the beginning there was only darkness, and then God said, let there be light. And the light was good in the intention that if you invoke goodness into your heart, you may step and awaken said light, which from every particular story you might find in all human literature, in all human storytelling, we essentially see that in all human storytelling, once again you rise to that particular conclusion. In the beginning was only darkness, from which the character arc becomes light, the protagonist. And in the protagonist, you might find that in the driving force of the ability of the protagonist, you see a particular drive, a force that allows an individual to essentially move forward to lead the story of the particular story. Because if they did not have this particular force, they would not be the protagonist of said story. They would simply just be a background character at that particular notion. But even within said particular background characters, once again, in any particular story, we see their character development, which in their character development is the exact same arc of the story ever told. In the beginning, there was only darkness, and then God whispered, let there be light. Every moment beyond any particular story told from the first story told, because even within the biblical literature from said first story told, we then see all of the rest of story being told, which points to the same conclusion. At the end of the literature, you may find once again that even in the beginning, there was only darkness. And then God said, let there be light. And the light was good. The first day. And upon the first day, you might find that the story continues into the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh. Now that leads to linear time continuing forward, which means from the point of the creation, the first story ever told, we see the two duality of these energies essentially manifest themselves in, every single story ever being told, the interpretation of life for each individual, which from this particular duality or power struggle to step into said light, one might find that in their own interpretation, in their own tale of life, you are actively speaking yourself into your story. For the Word became flesh. Now, in said particular story, one might find and argue for the power of the light, and some may argue for the power of the darkness. Ultimately, the moral compass is the deciding factor, but we then find in each particular duality what ultimately leads to the protagonist and antagonist mentalities, which we first see at Cain and Abel, once again arising once again. In the beginning was only light, and then God whispered, "Let there be," or pardon me, in the beginning there was only darkness, and then God said, "Let there be light." In the battles between light and darkness, one might find that in the darkness, the jealousy crippling the self, Cain, unable to give the best of his best, the good intention, the light being good, unable to step into said light to experience God's grace, resulting in him ultimately performing an act of violence, killing his brother Abel being of the best good intention to offer to said God's grace. You may then take the first point of that story in the biblical literature, and in any particular exchange within any particular conversation now being said in said biblical literature, you might find once again the power struggle between light and dark. In the power struggle, we essentially see that the light, also known as the Son of God, in the exchanges of the literature of conversation, we essentially see that in him, it is not him seeking to extinguish the light in others, but he is simply seeking to cause them to come to said light. Arising to an occasion, I am tempting you, may you rise to said light. And in the statements that Christ himself spoke, you may find subjective truths, that which from these subjective truths the disciples themselves are not extinguished in their light. They simply speak the truth they always needed to hear, becoming their own light. And in becoming their own light, we see once again the story of, in the beginning, there was only darkness. And then God said, "Let there be light." The story takes place at the individual level, which upon having a thought reflection resulting in you arising to a conclusion, you might experience, if the conclusion is of a good nature, you may experience said light. And ultimately, the entire biblical literature leads to a morality, which is to live to the book. And from living according to said book, you may arise to said light. The depth at which you read the entire literature ultimately leads back in its conclusion once again to the initial first story ever told. From the darkness, an individual may arise to light. Within themselves, And in that particular statement, you can actively find that from the very first story ever told, all other stories ever told are based on one particular story. Even the first story ever told, being the Bible, is based on that first particular story. The story of the creation of the universe. In the beginning, there was only darkness. And then God said, "Let there be light." And the light was good. Upon discovering said light upon yourself, you are now faced as an individual with your decision-making abilities, your dilemma, spoken, that which in your discipline you might find by a father-like figure, whether it be of your familial father figure or a higher power father figure, which even your father figure may have multiple father figures known as mentors. And in mentors, you might have particular idols. And said particular idols, they themselves ultimately arise to the same light. The highest power, God. And in the ascension to God, which in its ascension you may find a descension, a conclusion leading to a return to the cyclical pattern of the entire story. Because ultimately, this exact story is of cyclical nature. It repeats itself in all human tales, which from one initial story, all human story told is the same story ever told. From the light, in the beginning there was only darkness, and then God whispered, "Let there be light." Now the light might not be good. If you don't have said good intention in your heart, you may not invoke said light. If you don't have said good intention in your heart, which ultimately leads to the conclusion of inherently good. In order to arise to that particular light, an individual needs to feel inherently good within their heart in order to invoke said light. And if you can't invoke said light, you invoke said darkness. And in the tale of the human, at each individual level, once again is the same story told. The power struggle, or the inability to essentially create the arc in your own life. To go from the darkness and step into the light. Now you can take this even in a psychologist perspective, which in the tale told from the patient perspective, you might find this patient might tell you their life story. Which within even their life story, I can point particular repetitive patterns of, once again, the first story ever being told. In the beginning, there was only darkness, and then God said, "Let there be light." The moment an individual understands the art of storytelling, you arise to every particular story ever told in the entirety of the universe is as a result of one particular story cyclically being repeated and told from the moment of creation. And this ultimately leads to the final conclusion of this video, which is, if in the art of creating a story, you need to come to a conclusion that ultimately leads back to the initial point of the story, this would make it give a meaning. And in said meaning, you might find once again returning to the beginning, which means at the end of life's story, once again, you arise to the beginning. Upon discovering said light and finding it within yourself to invoke, you might find at the end of said life, you once again arise at the beginning, the conclusion that re-enters the cyclical nature, which in said cyclical nature, we see in said tale the notion of resurrection. The resurrection of self is the rebirth, a continuation of life even beyond the concluding moment, which in the faith one may find that in this particular teaching, from the first story ever told, the story of life, in the beginning there was only darkness, and God whispered, "Let there be light," which at the conclusion of your life, you may essentially experience said light, which all of meaning throughout all of particular human literature and storytelling tells the same story, which arises once again to you as a viewer listening to this story. In the beginning, there was only darkness, and then God said, "Let there be light," and the light was good. What might be a conclusion to said moral compass? Arriving upon living to said book, living to said story, living the very first story ever told, to the very few that have lived their life according to such, very few may then be given themselves a fair judgment. And upon said fair judgment, you may enter the light, heaven. And in this conclusion, once again, at the end of the concluding moment of the story told, you arrive at the beginning once again. In the beginning there was only darkness, and then God said, "Let there be light." Achieving said light can be done at any particular moment, simply by, in your life, driving your life force with good intention, good-heartedness. And within said good-heartedness, you may find that the moment you step towards the light emits, the light becomes visible. And in the emittance of the light, you see your potential continue and continue and continue and continue throughout your life, giving your life more meaning the more you use good intention behind said life, which, if God's grace is a feeling that which may be experienced upon being given said feeling, and upon said being given said feeling, you may give it to another, and upon another experiencing it themselves, they may return it back said feeling to you in order to return said feeling you first experienced back to God, known as God's grace. In the entire story of the literature, of every particular story ever told based on the very first story, the story of the creation of the universe, which at that particular conclusion you arise to returning God's grace to God, entering heaven. Entering heaven may be as simple as the mind state you take on from your life going forward. At every particular direction, you are faced with a fork in the road. And upon your deciding factor, which forks you will ultimately have to take, because different forks invoke different paths. And according to each path, you ultimately are the deciding force behind making these decisions in your life. But according to stepping to the light or stepping to the dark, you might find the continuation of your life story take on a different path beyond your ability to make said decision. And upon making said decision repeatedly throughout all of your life, you may arise to returning to God's grace, the light